bicycle facilities. But I just want to share a few more of the off-road facilities from last module that I just thought were interesting examples. This is content that's been sent in from previous participants. So this is just a local shared path of a previous participant, and that idea of not installing hazards within the shared path or providing that half-meter offset is clearly not being achieved here. And using line marking is kind of a last resort. It reduces the risk, but it's certainly a much better idea to eliminate the risk. And this, another classic one of if you can't fit your stencil in of your person or your bicycle, it's probably not wide enough to be a shared path. So this one is an absolute ripper, which I just not really entirely sure how this one got installed. But anyway, we've actually got to start this session with a poll, Ken, if you don't mind launching that one up. So within the 360 video that we got you to watch from last session, there were these two different examples of cyclists' facilities crossing over carriageways or crossing over roads. Example 1 on the left here and example 2. And the question is simply, which example shows best practice design for shared path crossing a road? Give you just a moment to fill in your answers there.
Yeah, and you can move the little poll box around on your screen, I think, if you want. You should be able to do that.
Absolutely.
And remember, of course, throughout the session, pop your questions, your comments in the chat, and do it as we're going, because I'll be feeding those to Max at different points, and it's always good to have that chat happening behind the scenes.
We'll give it a couple more seconds. Remember, you're not marked on these poll questions, so if you're not sure, just pop in an answer. All right, 3, 2, 1, and we'll end the poll there.
Share the results.
Everyone is going for example number 1, which is the raised crossing point, which I completely agree with. Much safer for cyclists and just more convenient because you don't have to slow down and get off your bike, and it's not just shared path ends. You get one continuous journey. So fantastic to see that we're getting that consistent results there. Today's focus is going to be on-road infrastructure, as mentioned. So we're getting really stuck into what protected bicycle lanes are and how to implement them through a design point of view. We'll also talk about on-road bicycle lanes, so not in a protected setting, but actually adjacent the dooring zone, and what are other treatments that could be implemented there. We don't have the benefit of adding protection. And then finally, actually mixing cyclists in with general traffic as well through the use of sharrows and local area traffic management treatments. So bit to cover in today's discussion, but as Ken mentioned, please keep the questions coming in. First slide that we've got here is an example of a protected bicycle lane, and what that terminology is actually referring to is typical road configurations would have a parking lane kind of right up here against the curb and channel or right next to the footpath, and then a bicycle lane would be adjacent the parking lane. And the issue with that is you've got cyclists then that are within the dooring zone. So when the driver obviously opens their door, that's where the bicycle lane is in traditional setups. And also you've got cyclists riding adjacent a live traffic lane. A protected bicycle lane flips that configuration and instead puts the bicycle lane closer to the curb and channel or closer to the footpath and pushes the parking lane out. And the way that this is achieved is through the use of these separators. And there's a whole raft of different treatments or installation devices you can use to create that separation. But that's really critical in creating these protected bicycle lanes. This one is actually a really good example of protected bicycle lane because it's wide enough to allow two cyclists to ride abreast, like as shown in the photo. And the reason that's so important, or why that is so attractive, is if you are a commuter cyclist and you want to travel quite quickly and you get stuck behind a cyclist that, you know, is just doing it for a leisurely ride or is off to get their groceries or whatever reason, dropping off the kids at primary school. If this wasn't a wide enough facility, you've basically just created a kind of a tunnel where there's no way to overtake or get away from any kind of obstacle in the way. Whereas in this particular facility, they've created it so it's wide enough so you are able to overtake and provide for both, or a bigger variety of cyclist levels, which is fantastic. All right, before we get into the design details, we'll just have a quick chat around, you know, well, what's the point of doing all this? Why would we look to implement protected bicycle lanes? And through a survey, a study done by City of Melbourne back in 2017, and I dare say results would be similar now and in different jurisdictions, so don't get too hung up on the date or the location. But in this study, 83% of people said they felt comfortable riding in a protected bicycle lane format. A traditional bicycle lane or painted lane, only 22% felt confident riding within that space. So when we are talking about designing for, you know, greater diversity within cycling communities and trying to aim for, or keeping in mind that we've got cyclists aged 8 to 80, you can see we're not really hitting the mark if we're only able to cater for 22% of the community. It's, you know, a significantly low portion of the community that feel comfortable within that space. Whereas you can see this type of facility where you've got actual separation from live traffic and from the parked vehicles, it's just seen as more favorable and just offers a much better safety benefit. So that's the kind of community sentiment. They actually feel like it's a better facility for them, and they're more inclined to get on two wheels if that's being installed. When we look at our protected bicycle lanes, there's two main ways or configurations that you can actually implement this design. One is through a one-way path, which is shown here. So this is just a typical cross section where you'd have a protected bicycle lane on one side of the road and then another protected bicycle lane on the other side of the road. This is probably the most common that you will see across our jurisdictions, but there are examples of the other type, which we'll get into shortly. But what this obviously involves is, you know, you got your parking lane there, you got your separator, and then your bicycle lane, which is completely separate from all of that carriageway. It's almost a separate space. And that is completely mirrored on the other side of the carriageway. Here's an example of one just in Melbourne that kind of demonstrates this. Might give a prize out here, Ken, if anyone can suggest a reason that we might have these little breaks in the separator. So you can see there's just these little gaps within these separators. Any suggestions from participants as to why that might be occurring?
And it links in pretty well with Lachlan's comment question there. So we've got lots of comments around drainage, stormwater.
Absolutely.
A comment around DDA from car parks as well, parking spots.
I do have a separate slide about DDA and managing that around these separators. So I might leave that until we get to that slide. But yeah, the storm water or the drainage issue was the one I was after there, because if this was to be, you know, solid curb the whole way there, then you'd get water that would pond within this area or possibly all the way back to the traffic lanes. But you create these little gaps and it means you can use your existing drainage line just to get rid of all that stormwater. So you don't have to build new drain inlets or anything like that.
Good. And you'll talk a little bit more about that, that car park one shortly. So I'm giving a prize out there, am I, Hannah?
Yeah, just the first person that said stormwater, I'd say.
Yeah, Hannah's on the prize board.
Excellent. All right, shall we keep going?
Mm-hmm.
The other type of configuration that you can see within protected bicycle lanes is bidirectional facility, which basically just means putting all the cyclists on one side of the road. So you can see cyclists can travel in both directions just on this one side of the carriageway. So it's no longer a mirror image. It's no longer symmetrical. Cyclists are instead given this is where you can ride. This is much more appropriate where all the facilities and amenities and things of interest for cyclists are on that one side of the carriageway, and this other side of the carriageway doesn't have that same, generation of traffic. That's when this would be appropriate. But if you do have equally, popular destinations on either side of the carriageway, then you're just going to be getting lots of cyclists that are forced to kind of cross either in mid-block locations or at intersections, and there may be no actual cycling facility for them on that side. So one of the things to keep in mind of if you're going for the bidirectional facility is, what is the actual adjacent land use for these facilities? And, is that actually going to serve the cycling community? Is that going to be appropriate for them? Another question I'll throw out to the group is the previous separators that I've shown in the slides have all been wide, or at least wider. This one is quite a narrow one. So this is a bidirectional facility, but the separator in particular is quite narrow. It's about 300 mil. Any suggestions? This one is quite technical, so I'd be surprised if we get this one, but any idea why this one may be a narrower facility as opposed to the other examples we've seen?
Right, we do have some comments have come in quickly. Matt saying, well, there's no dooring opportunity there, and Karen's talking about the space available.
Yeah.
There's also in there talking about potentially clearways, so there's no parking, so and linking there with the dooring. And Samita's on limited space, constrained carriageway width from Michael as well. So lots of good answers there, Max.
I think they all get a big tick, to be honest. I think they're all very relevant. Absolutely the carriageway space, limited there unless you're going to start taking traffic lanes, which is always a challenging conversation. If you were providing wider separators, obviously that's going to encroach on your available cross section, but most pertinent, what was discussed as the first point was this is actually a general traffic lane. So you're not actually going to have vehicles stopping there and opening their door. Thus, the dooring risk doesn't exist at these locations. Therefore, you've got the narrow separator being adopted in these instances. So there's a bit of thinking behind that decision. Ultimately, the wider gap that you can provide, or the greater the separation, the better the outcome. Because just, anecdotally, cycling along here, if you're in that direction and then there's a vehicle only 300 mil away from you on the opposite side of you, it's a bit of a strange feeling to have. It's a little bit unsettling. So the wider separator that you can provide there, even if there isn't the dooring risk, is certainly favourable, but acknowledge that generally the separators are installed there to eliminate the dooring risk. Anything on your second? No? Righty. See another question that came in.
Before you get started, is there any sort of documentation on that width and where you would use, or what width you would use in different scenarios? Is there any standard documentation or anything that you're aware of?
Yeah, there is. So within the Austroads Guide, AGRD Part 6 A, you'll find all your bicycle lane widths that would be appropriate to be installing there, both for one direction and bi-directional facilities there.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Now, got this big looking table that looks a little bit confusing and goes into lots of detail, but I think it's actually easiest to talk to these points just with some examples. So I might just skip straight over this and go into some photos, but it's basically just categorizing what are the considerations or advantages of either a one-way bicycle lane versus a bidirectional. So there's some extra considerations if you are doing bidirectional. You can see that there's a few more crosses there. So I'll just get stuck into it. Here we've got this vehicle exiting, could be a driveway or it could be a local street. Doesn't really matter what it is. We'll just say it's a driveway in this instance, and is aiming to enter this traffic stream. And this is just a one-way traffic. However, it is a bi-directional bicycle lane that they're crossing over. So you've got cyclists traveling in both directions. Now, if you could put yourself in the position of that vehicle that is exiting the driveway, intuitively, the person is facing oncoming traffic. That's what we've been trained to think about, and that's obviously the biggest concern. The 1.5 ton piece of metal that's coming towards you, and you want to pick a gap there. That's what you're focused on. So you're looking in that direction, meaning a cyclist that is kind of heading into the screen or to the left there is likely to be sighted. It's likely to be a peripheral thing, but generally they're going to be within the line of vision of a motorist that's exiting that driveway. Unfortunately, this cyclist that's traveling in the opposing direction is not really within that line of sight. We're not really within that space where we've, been thinking to look both ways in these scenarios. Instead, we're focused on the traffic stream, what direction they're going, and focusing on them, as opposed to, thinking about cyclists traveling in both directions. So the way that it's mitigated in this scenario, which is quite a common way to be doing it, is just, colored pavement to suggest that there's cyclists in that area. Now, that doesn't necessarily demonstrate to look in both directions is the only issue there. So things like, putting little arrows there to demonstrate the cyclists are in both directions, advanced warning if there's any signage that could be put prior to the driver exiting the driveway there as well. But something to consider if you are working within this space, how to mitigate that as a risk. Another similar kind of risk here for a bidirectional facility is for a right turning vehicle. So I've just annotated this car here, for them to be turning and accessing into this little local street or minor street, generally they're focused on the vehicle here. That's where they're going to be focused. That's where their attention is, which means by default, they're also to some extent looking at all the cyclists traveling towards them. Unfortunately, the cyclists highlighted in yellow there would be much more difficult to be able to spot. It's just not really the way that we've been trained, and also not the way that we are physically able to look, because you'd have to look right across your back shoulder there to be able to see a cyclist that's traveling in the same direction as you. So it's just an inconvenient way to be able to sight any road users within that space. So another one to consider if you are looking at bidirectional facilities, how that type of risk could be mitigated. And one thing that you could look to do if there was available space is providing these little like propping zones, I suppose you could call them, where a right turn vehicle, just has to pick a gap for general traffic and then stops and pauses before crossing over the bicycle facility, and then gives way to cyclists traveling in both directions before accessing the minor leg there. Ken.
I was going to just add a little bit to that. Hopefully I'm not stealing your next thunder, but in that area is good to sort of use a cobblestone effect, a bluestone or something to slow vehicles as well and get them activated in that task.
Absolutely. Good thinking, Ken. Nice cobblestones there. Okie dokie. So we've talked a lot about the separators. I'm going to go through just a few different examples of what the separators can actually look like, because we have this idea in our head that the separators need to look something like this, referred to as a kind of Copenhagen style separator. But there are other devices out there, so just wanted everyone to get up to speed with what can be installed. These ones are obviously very good because they look like a finished product. They look like it's part of the streetscape and not something temporary or not something that's, you know, going to be removed soon. And also, due to their width, they do have the ability to fully house an open door. So a door can open as wide as 1.5 meters from the vehicle. And typically, these facilities are that 1.5 meter wide. Although that one looks a little bit narrow, but anyway, if you can aim to have those separators at 1.5 meters, you're really doing a fantastic job of eliminating the risk of dooring. Speaking of the separators, very technical detail here. If we think about the curb profile of our separator, so for those that aren't familiar with curb profiles, there's three main ones, but the ones I'll talk about are a barrier curb profile, which looks something like that, which is shown in the first image there, which is basically just a straight vertical rise or concrete rise. And then there's a semi-mountable type, which has got a much nicer bevel on it or a 45-degree angle on it. So it's semi-mountable, as the name suggests. When you're doing protected bicycle lanes, the general, flavor or the best way to be installing these or designing these is to have a semi-mountable profile on the bicycle lane side, because that means if a cyclist, is to veer out of the lane, they aren't just going to strike something that's just a vertical face and something that's going to make them fall over. They're much more likely to stay on their bike if it's a semi-mountable curb face. And then provide a barrier profile on the parking lane side. So just on how these images are working, on the left-hand image, we've got a barrier and a barrier. So we don't want to see the barrier on the bicycle side, but on the parking side is fine. The middle image, we've got semi-mountable and semi-mountable. We do want to see the semi-mountable on the cyclist side, but not the parking lane. And the third one is kind of what we'd see as the ideal result, where we don't want to just make it really easy for vehicles to mount the separator and access that space, because that really reduces the impact of these devices. And just to show you an example of that happening in the real world, this is infrastructure that was installed within Melbourne. And you can see that it might be a bit difficult to see, but that's a semi-mountable profile on the bicycle lane side. And it's also been installed on the parking lane side. And you can see lots of vehicles are actually parking on the separator itself. You can see that there. If that were to have been changed to a barrier profile, something like that, be much less likely for vehicles to mount that, unless they're driving a four-wheel drive, I guess, and they can do whatever they want. Much like this fellow here who chose to park within the bicycle lane itself. But just those small little design detail changes can actually make quite a big difference and mitigate the risk of getting into that cyclist space. this is just a photo at night, so you can see both sides of that a little bit clearer when there's not so many parked cars there. Okay, this is throwing back to that question regarding DDA or disability car parks. How do we manage that adjacent separators? And yes, it absolutely needs to be considered because the separators themselves are, a raised tripping hazard, or they do require, some degree of mobility to be able to traverse across. You will need to create a gap in there, a suitable gap, to ensure that people in wheelchairs or mobility devices are able to access the adjacent footpath. So this is just a obviously general arrangement, just a layout of what could be used. But yeah, ensuring that you've located where these disabled car parks exist, and then ensuring that there's a solution there for them to be able to access the parks and also access the footpath. And that is achieved via a curb ramp. So there's one location where this is where we're going to provide access to for those users. And this is also, you could put some colored pavement in there, or you could also do a little zebra crossing across the bicycle lane there, just to raise the awareness that, there's people with mobility needs accessing this space. So definitely something to be cognizant of, and ensuring that you're maintaining that connectivity for them. Here's an interesting example of something it nearly went okay, but didn't quite pass the pub test, so to speak. Bit difficult to see, so I just zoomed it in there, but you can see that they did decide to do a little zebra crossing across the bicycle lane, which is a good idea. I think zebra crossings are quite well understood by the general public, so people know, they see that they have to slow down and give way to peds. So it's quite effective. The only issue is you can see that it means that the pedestrian crossing there would actually have to step down onto the carriageway or onto the bicycle lane and then back up to get to the bus stop, or vice versa. So there's no curb ramps there. So if you're in a wheelchair, you would have not much hope of getting across that facility, which is not a great outcome. That has been fixed since. So this was just one that we happened to snap while we were out there, but it has been fixed since. Question there from Lachlan: are DTP DOT signing off on MOAs for these crossings? I believe that any crossing that is designated as a zebra crossing and has these regulatory signs are required an MOA. I'm happy to be corrected from Ken, but he looks like he's nodding as well.
Yeah, that's correct. So yeah, they would, in theory.
But they're much smaller and they don't seem to have the same significance. But I think by the letter of the law, yes. Are they willing to?
I don't see any reason why they wouldn't be willing to. I mean, they've moved to a principle-based decision-making around pedestrian crossings rather than warrants and such. But
yeah,
interesting question.
Yeah, it's a pretty valid point. An MOA, a memorandum of agreement?
Authorization.
Yeah. Basically, the Victorian Transport Agency, the Vic Roads Department of Transport, they will give you a sheet of paper to say you are authorized to install this sign at this location because it has legal ramifications of doing it. So it just acknowledges that you can't just go out and start plonking these signs anywhere. You need to have that piece of paper. Okay, back to our separators. So this is another example of a separator. So it's similar to what we were looking at before. Narrow separation. These are actually bolt down. So they're actually readily installable. Installable? That's not a word. Easy to install. And so that has a real benefit if you are looking at trialing infrastructure. So, maybe during an event that you may have, and it's really important that you get cyclist traffic located adjacent this event or traveling to this event and keeping them safe. You could theoretically just install these for the duration of the event and then rip them up, or as part of a longer trial where you want to see what sentiment is like of taking up a traffic lane and ensuring that it is, and putting in a bicycle lane instead. Use this as, well, we're just trialing it, and if it's successful, then we'll look to implement more permanent solutions. But yes, and sorry, I just saw another question in there from Karen. I haven't seen any Wallies yet. I apologize. I did make a note to make reference to that at the start, but then I forgot to check my notes. So there's no Wallies in today's presentation. So there's no Wombat. So apologies, Karen, you have to wait that long. You're not missing out. There's no Wallies because there's an assignment at the end of today's module instead of a quiz. So I'll take you through to the assignment instead. So apologies for missing out on that. Another separator type is using planter boxes. This one, I'm a big greenie, so I certainly love the streetscape improvement and just making it more of a green space. But the issue I have with it is these planter boxes are often at that pedal strike height that we were talking about on Tuesday's session. So if it's kind of within that 200 mil from the ground height, that's considered, within pedal striking distance and creates a hazard. So number one, they should be counted as a hazard. And the other thing is, although they may look very pretty on day one of installation, they don't look like that 6 months down the track, if no one's maintaining it or if they've been struck and all those type of things. So I like them in principle, but they do require a bit of thinking about them. This is an example of one in New Zealand where they installed these type of planter boxes, and you can see one of these got struck, and they also seem to be quite movable, these ones, because they're not quite all lining up perfectly, which is a bit odd. Just another example of different types of separators that you can be using. Got another question that I'll throw out to the chat group. Any ideas what this little type of separator is called? And the clue that I'll give you is it's named after an animal. This is one of your favorites, isn't it, Ken?
Well, I like the naming of it, but
yeah.
We've got guesses along the lines of bees and armadillos.
Very good. They are called an armadillo, and they are 100% recycled products. That's what I was writing there while Ken was having a little chat. I actually prefer the bumblebee name. I think that's a much nicer name. But yeah, armadillo.
So who are you going to give prize to? The correct or the one you prefer?
Let's go both.
Both. Love it. Okay.
2 prizes.
Karen and Hannah prizes.
And while we have a bit of fun around this particular separator, I'm not 100% sure how effective they are in creating that separation, because I think I've got another photo of them here actually. When you look at it from this angle, particularly when they're in white, black and white, the black and white one is called the Zebra, by the way. They are not incredibly conspicuous, and it's actually very easy if you are in a car to drive straight over the top of them. So they don't have that same level of delineation as the other separators did. But anyway, just another product that's out there on the market.
Yeah, and there's a bit of concern also from cyclists hitting them drifting out. Yeah. It's a more abrupt hit than sort of sliding along a separator.
Absolutely. Just got a couple more examples of these kind of temporary pop-down separators, the pop-up separators, whatever you want to call them, bolt-down. These were quite prominent during the COVID lockdown here in Melbourne, where we got to see lots of these pop-up bicycle lanes being installed. Once again, has that benefit of being a bolt-down fix, so easy to install and disassemble if required. I do like these ones because you've got these paddles that kind of sit up above. So it just improves that delineation a lot more. Just another example. This was a really awesome site for me personally, because I used to ride here all the time, but also just as a case study, because during the COVID period, this arterial road, state managed road, lots of traffic in the inner city area. There used to be a bicycle lane on road, and then in this bridge section, so this is crossing over a bridge, cyclists used to be forced to get off road and get into this really, really narrow spot adjacent or on the footpath, basically. You can kind of see it on the other side there, just that really tight spot. But during COVID, they were like, you know what, we'll take this entire traffic lane and give it to cyclists, one on each side, and cyclists can ride there instead. And that's still currently installed like that. And it's such a better outcome for cyclists. And traffic congestion was poor beforehand in that area, and traffic congestion is still poor in that area. So I can't see it's made a significant difference, even though you've taken up a traffic lane. And also the cycling volumes through there have certainly increased. So it's no longer just a very comfortable commuter cyclist that, will ride in anything. You've got, parents with children now and things like that riding in this environment. So a really good example of, if you're, willing to be a little bit bold and challenge the norm and all those types of things, and you've identified routes that this is where we need to prioritize cycling, then really invest in the infrastructure that prioritizes cycling. This is my final little separated type. This one's a bit of an unusual one. It's basically just like flexible bollards that are just installed every 6 meters or something like that. It's got a little bit of reflective tape on it. It's unusual because it is a clear way. So at some hours of the day, you're actually allowed to park in this lane, meaning the dooring risk exists. At other times, it's just a general traffic lane. So you can understand why it's not always a perfect world, I guess, to be able to get the best infrastructure. But because this dooring risk does exist at certain times of the day, I think it could have triggered, perhaps we should start looking at investing in upgrading the adjacent path here where there is a bit of space to be able to implement a shared use path and try and get greater separation away from the general traffic and the carriageway itself. So yeah, not the greatest fan of these ones, and they do get hit all the time. That's the other thing. Got another little exercise for everyone today. We've got another confused cyclist. This one looks very familiar. Who's this? Someone asking what's wrong with this photo. So I might get rid of that cyclist there. And in the chat, if you want to pop down any ideas as to what you think is wrong with this photo or anything that stands out to you.
Okay. We're seeing lots of people worried about the dooring risk. Absolutely.
I've been thinking I should do a little game show music during this segment, Ken.
That's not a bad idea. Let's see if we got anything else comes in. Dooring. No exit left. Sure what that's referring to. No separator. Pedestrians on the bike lane. No separator. Narrow lane. People skating ahead. Is it a skateboarder? People on the bike path. Okay. So we started off with all dooring, and then we got to everybody saying there's some pedestrians or somebody else, some people using this bike facility.
We do have some eagle vision there. The significant risk there, I certainly would say, is the dooring. Okay. Absolutely. So well spotted with regards to the dooring. But spot on. The people in the distance you've got a skateboarder there and a scooterer as well. So incredible vision there to be able to see that. But certainly the main risk I'd be concerned about there is the dooring and what we can look to do to mitigate that as a risk.
There's a comment about the roadway width and the 40 km/h speed zone, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is quite wide. So you've got all this space here. I actually don't know the history of why it is so wide there. Do you think there was parking on the other side there as well, Ken?
Yeah, there used to be.
There used to be.
Good St Kilda Road down there, and yeah, there was parking on both sides.
Yeah,
and it's all this old carriageway width for the big I don't know what you call it, avenue.
Yeah. Just looking at Salmon's question there, do we need separator in 40 km/h zones? Yes, if there's a risk of the dooring, I'd be recommending the separators regardless. So if you can put in a protected bicycle lane, that'd be a big win. Absolutely. 40 is better than 50, but not as good as 30. Very eloquently put. Agreed. Yes. Any kind of changes, even a small reduction in speed, has a really big difference in the level of risk. So it's not like a linear relationship. So even if you're getting, just a operating speed difference of a few kilometers, it actually does impact the level of risk of both the likelihood and the severity of a crash occurring. So wonderful that rhetoric has been adopted there, Michael. So there was a lot of space to include some separation or even some landscaping even, yeah. And this project is incredibly political. It has been for many, many, many years. It's probably the most common commuter route into Melbourne CBD, and has for many years been basically this, just rows and rows of dooring zones the whole way through. And there is an entire project at the moment that is looking to provide protected bicycle facilities the whole way into the city. So this won't always look like this, and at the moment, in fact, it looks like a giant construction site. So there's lots of temporary traffic management set up and detours in place and things like that, because they're building a new train station near that shrine. Anyway, I digress. Dooring. So that is what the answer I was actually looking for in the previous photo, and something that is a significant risk to cyclists, both from a individual risk, like when people tend to say, how come you don't cycle, or what routes do you avoid? Lots and lots of times you will hear the comment of, I don't want to be doored, I don't want to get near car doors. I've got lots of friends that ride regularly but don't ride on road for the pure reason of don't want to be next to or involved in a collision like this, which is understandable. So it can be enough to put people off riding altogether. So really important that we're implementing designs that removes that as a risk. I've got this video here. Hopefully this plays nice and smoothly at your end. And this is one of Ken. So this is actually using the 360, the camera, and pointing the camera backwards. We managed to get this snap of Ken nearly getting cleaned up there by a door and just exiting motorist there, oblivious to being against the bicycle lane and not doing the Dutch reach there, were they, Ken?
No, yeah, Max and I are out doing cycling audits and gotta have your wits about you. But certainly that separated Copenhagen style lane would have been nice in that location.
Absolutely. Anyway, glad we only got a near miss. It's good to hear, Ken.
And the Dutch reach was talked about in the webinar trivia, which was about using your opposite hand to open the door, forcing you to turn and look by doing that.
Yeah, That's it. The Dutch rates, just worth a Google if you're still a bit confused there. There was this study done regarding where dooring occurs, and one of those studies that I'm not sure really ever needed to be commissioned, but the overwhelming majority of dooring incidents are occurring on the driving side. So we've got 75%. So that makes sense because you've got a driver. A driver always needs to be in the car, so there's always going to be a driver door opening. And generally, most of our bicycle lanes are adjacent the driver's side. So that's where the conflict exists. It makes a lot of sense. The 25% on the passenger side, this one may be a little bit more confusing to understand. And the reason for that is, if you can imagine, if you're at like a signalized intersection and there's a stopped car or a square, and you're a cyclist riding on this side, and this happens to actually just be a taxi, and they just got to let out a passenger. They just open up their door, and that's how those types of dooring incidents can occur. I've been involved in that type of incident, and luckily it didn't hurt or, damage me in any way, just damage the vehicle. Yeah, it's certainly this one, I would say, a bit more of a concern, considering also if you are falling off your bicycle against the driver's side, it's not uncommon to see a cyclist then fall into the live traffic lane, which could then obviously have further safety risks associated with it. This is just a high-level matrix that you can use to be able to influence what kind of treatments may be appropriate to install in different road uses. So just if you are into this space, about like a high level or strategic planning, if, for instance, you've got a bus priority routes, things that you may be appropriate, it's just shown in the green, is relocation of parking, relocating cyclists, one-way protected lanes, two-way protected lanes, or off-road paths. What's not considered appropriate, that red dot, is if it's a bicycle priority route, you shouldn't be thinking about relocating cyclists, which makes sense. It's just a really high-level matrix to help inform decisions and can be used to, back up any of your own recommendations. Yeah.
Sorry, Max, I was just checking. Next module, you talk about vehicle left turns conflicting with cyclist route, don't you? So we'll cover that next module, Michael.
Okay, no sweat. Okay, I've got this other example, which is Glenferrie Road here in Melbourne, and a little bit difficult to see, but can you see that there's only like this little stripe of green? So the whole bicycle lane wasn't painted green, just this little stripe. The intent of this trial was cyclists would ride further away from the dooring zone, which is also, closer to the light rail or the tram and closer to the live traffic lane, but I digress. Further away from the dooring zone. That was the intent of it. And they did a study and evaluation of how cyclists felt through this and what, the actual measurements were. And there was a sentiment of 75% of cyclists felt more comfortable riding when they had this little green stripe, which is that's incredibly high in my opinion. And there was an actual attributed lateral shift in where cyclists were positioning themselves. So it was around 200 mil away from the dooring zone where cyclists were positioning themselves. So it did actually achieve its target of trying to get cyclists away from the dooring zone. But in terms of best practice, I don't consider this being that. It's just one way to mitigate the risk. But if we were looking to really prioritize cycling within this space, we'd have to be looking at protected bicycle lanes. But just as an FYI, this is to get installed, and it is currently still out there as well. So obviously the evaluation was considered effective. This was a similar treatment done in Hastings in New Zealand, where they just had these dotted green lines all the way through the bicycle lane. The intent wasn't actually for cyclists to ride on the line like it's shown there. It just happens to be shown in that photo. It's basically just a continued reminder for any motorists that are, entering the parking lane, that it's a bicycle lane. So rather than just paint the whole thing in green, they just did this lines. Once again, I haven't seen the evaluation for this particular treatment, but I wouldn't expect it to be significantly high. What can we do though? If we are forced to do on-road bicycle lanes, we don't have the ability to move out the parking lane and create Copenhagen lanes or the protected bicycle lanes. Well, we could look at using line marking or chevrons to be able to demarcate the space both between the parking lane and the general traffic lane. So what's referred to as a double chevron. Those are some details if you want to take down any notes of what type of dimensions would be acceptable to use within these scenarios. We could look at installing a single chevron. So that's one where it's only being installed adjacent to the parking lane. You might do this in locations where there's a relatively high turnover in vehicles within the parking lane. In other words, it could be a time zone. Maybe there's a 2-hour limit there or something like that, which means you've got a lot of vehicles opening their door, and this risk is seen higher than a vehicle just entering the bicycle lane from the live traffic lane. It's just another example of one in wonderful New Zealand. And you can also have the single chevron, on the traffic lane side. So in these scenarios, you would probably expect that there's a lower turnover in parking vehicles, meaning the door isn't opening as much, meaning you may be more concerned about general traffic accessing the bicycle lane and providing extra buffer on that side of the bicycle lane. I wouldn't say there's necessarily a science behind it, but that is a general principle that can be used to help support where to put the buffer. Exclusive bike lanes. This is probably the most common on our arterial network. And they're installed in relatively high speeds as well, 60, 70, 80 km/h roads. We can see exclusive bike lanes. I kind of have the sentiment of, if you're willing to put this much space to a cycling facility, you should be able to build some degree of separation for cyclists, just to be able to give them that extra feeling of safety and provide that increased delineation. So not just using line marking and colored pavement. A wide curbside bike lane. This has been in the standards for decades now. It's basically just this little ... and then another 200 meters later, ... bike lane. I really don't see any benefit in doing this. There's probably marginal benefit in that at that particular time you might be expecting to see a cyclist, but not one I'd be advocating for, particularly where these historically have been installed, which has been higher speed roads as well. So not one I'm overly enthused about. All right, we'll get to the stage now of mixing cyclists with general traffic. In this environment, it isn't actually mixed traffic. It just kind of operates in that fashion because of the constrained location. But you can see this cyclist here, because they haven't been communicated that this is a mixed environment, you can ride in the middle of this carriageway, they're still positioning themselves to the very left of the road, which is right up against the dooring zone, like right next to the mirror. This is like a regular route for me. This is my route to work. So I pass this all the time. Very, very uncomfortable because you've got such a small gap in between the dooring zone and also a vehicle that's passing you as well. You know, they're unsure if they've got the room to pass you. You're unsure if they're going to overtake you or if the door's going to open, and it's not a good environment at all. So this is probably a candidate of a site where we could actually look at cyclists claiming the traffic lane and sharing the road. And through that, you would look to implement some local area traffic management treatments, which I'll get to in a second. But the way that we communicate that cyclists, you no longer have to ride on the left-hand side of the road, you know, right up against the gutter or the dooring zone or whatever it is. You can ride in the middle of the traffic lane, is through the use of these little things here. They're called sharrows, shared arrows. Generally, only recommended in environments less than 40 kilometers per hour. All these speeds listed on this diagram are not posted. They're like operating speeds. So you want to make sure that you're getting operating speeds lower than 40 before opting for lane sharing. The reason for that is because for those that have done a little bit of safe system training or are familiar with the safe system crash speeds and things like that, I'll just draw out this little graph. If I had on the y-axis the probability of a fatality, and along the x-axis, I need to just move something over there. There we go. Along the x-axis, I had our speed. The kind of curve or the way that this actually looks like, I'll use a different color just for a bit of fun. Looks a little bit something like this, where things kind of get exponentially worse at this point here, which is at the 30 kilometer per hour mark. And if, you know, if a cyclist is struck at this point here, which is, I'll just make it up, 90 kilometers, then that's almost like 99% chance of a fatal. But around that 30 kilometer per hour mark is what is generally seen as where things get exponentially worse for the survivability of a cyclist. So if you can manage those conflict points to 30 kilometers per hour or less, that's generally seen as best practice and alignment with safe system principles. Here's those sharrows in a little bit more detail. So just a stencil of how those might look. You may have seen them out on the network already and not been 100% sure what they are doing. My mum actually called me the other month and said that a few were installed just in her local area where I grew up, and she didn't know what they meant. So she called and asked me, which was lovely. But yes, they are communicating that it is a shared space now. So it's no longer cyclists have to push themselves all the way to the left-hand side. They can ride in the middle of the traffic lane and treat themselves just as if they were a car. Here's an example of the sharrows in use. This one is actually quite an interesting example in that it's been installed as part of a 30 kilometer per hour area. So you've got that speed that I was talking about. It's being really managed there to make sure that cyclists feel safe and they are comfortable riding on road in those areas. Another regional town now out in southwestern Victoria called Warrnambool, they also have implemented a 30 kilometer per hour speed limit, and they've used sharrows. So this is probably an easier example to understand what I'm talking about. Like a cyclist is able just to ride right in the middle here, as opposed to positioning themselves over to the left in the gutter. So it's all to do with that and communicating that. Here's an example of where not to install them. So we don't want to see them where cyclists are forced to cross over light rail tracks or any rail tracks for that matter, because that little gap is conveniently wide enough to house a tire, and it's incredibly common to see cyclists' wheels or their tire to get caught in those and come off their bicycle. So you don't want to be kind of recommending cyclists take that as a position, because then they have to cross over that track, which is not a good outcome. So that gets a big X, that one. Another example of where you don't want to be seeing this. I forgot I included this in as an example. This one's in Ontario in Canada, Ken, just in case you were wondering. But in kind of really busy, built up environments, multi-lane, you know, relatively high speed. This is not an appropriate spot at all for sharrows. Yeah, just thought I'd share that one as well. That one also gets the cross. So we've talked about the speed and how we want to aim to reduce operating speeds to 30 kilometers per hour or less within these shared areas where you've got cyclists taking up the carriageway. It's really critical that you have supporting local area traffic management treatments. It's such a mouthful. They really need to think of a better term. LATMs, local area traffic management treatments. Basically, what can we put to ensure that speeds are going to be reduced? Because if you just put up a sign here that says 30 or 40 or whatever it is, people are very unlikely just to follow that, and it's unlikely to have a significant reduction in speed. So the way to achieve that is through LATMs. Here's an example of a one-way slow point, or just a speed hump or a speed cushion, or whatever you'd like to call it. So it only lets one traffic direction at a time to pass, so you have to prop and wait. So that's obviously going to slow down vehicles. The fact that this is actually a vertical device, or like a hump, means it's going to slow down motorists. But what I really like about this example, this one's in Adelaide for anyone wondering, is if you're a cyclist, you actually get to bypass all of that because you're narrow enough to fit through that little section there. So you don't have to worry about that annoying little hump. So you have a nice, easy journey going along this street, but general traffic, you're going to be slowed down because this is considered a cycling corridor and we need to manage speeds. It's also a little bit difficult to see, but there is a sharrow just after that speed hump there. I'll get rid of my little graffitis there. See if you can see that. There's a sharrow over there. So this is kind of meant to be a cycling corridor. Similar idea. This one was in Christchurch in New Zealand, where you give cyclists a little bypass so they don't have to deal with the vertical deflection. Because it's not really them that we're trying to slow down. We're trying to slow down these big things. So just a nice little solution for cyclists. And yeah, Lachlan noted there that there was the yellow line marking there just to make sure that no vehicles are parking and blocking that bypass. Excellent vision there. Well done. We'll give Lachlan a prize. Good on you, Lachlan. All right, another local area traffic management treatment is this one that is shown from the perspective of a cyclist, but it's probably easier to comprehend it from an aerial shot. So I'll just skip straight over this one. So that photo was taken just about here. And basically what happens is if you're a vehicle, your path would look something like this if you wanted to travel through, which is, as you can imagine, incredibly inconvenient. However, if you're a cyclist, there was that gap in the curb and channel, so you can head straight through that. The kind of issue with this treatment in particular is, so if this little build out wasn't installed, just as an example, then vehicles could have traveled straight and cyclists could have traveled straight. So that's how things could have looked. What was installed or has been installed, this type of arrangement, whilst it seems good in principle, what it has actually introduced is these two conflict points. So for a motorist that just wants to travel through, they are now exposed to cyclists and, have to make sure that they're slowing down and giving way to cyclists and not interrupting their journey or going to collide with them twice. So you've basically just created these conflict points, and it's probably a difficult thing to measure, because also with this specific facility, the reason that it was implemented is because they didn't want to this was a common rat run, or a way to get in and out of the city and get to your main arterials. So try to make it less permeable, or make it less easy to get from A to B. So by installing this, you have reduced the amount of traffic volume heading through this street anyway. So it's likely just going to be local traffic there, just residents that live on this street or the adjacent streets. So yeah, there's an argument for and against this particular site as to why or why not to install it, this type of treatment. But another example of similar philosophy of creating these kind of closures is just not allowing vehicles through there at all, and only allowing cyclists. So once again, this is what it looks like on the ground. But if you were a vehicle and you were wanting to travel, through, you basically can't. You're forced to do a U-turn and travel the other way, get on a collector road, and then get on an arterial. So it's completely blocked that passage for general traffic. Conversely, cyclists get to travel straight through. Really, really common thing to be doing in your inner city areas, where you want to be basically making cycling more attractive. It can be incredibly difficult to get them on arterial networks where there's limited space and higher speeds and lots more traffic. But local streets, you've probably got a better chance of implementing cycling infrastructure. And if you're prioritizing cycling infrastructure, that can be at the detriment of general traffic. That's something to remember. If you're looking at your strategic cycling corridors, or what you as a LGA or state government have identified as this is the most important critical route for our cyclists, then that can be at the detriment for other transport users within there. So maybe cars don't have just as an easy time to get through there. Got a question there from Sanam asking, what about the pedestrian crossings? Where are they crossing? So I think that was back here. The pedestrians do still have access to the footpath from memory. It's just a little bit difficult to see in this photo, but this is where the pedestrians are, and then they cross over. You can kind of see some pedestrians over there as well. On the aerial, yeah, it's not very clear as to where the actual crossing point is, but presumably somewhere here. Doesn't look like there's a little gap in there for them. Anyway, hopefully that clarifies things. I think that was my last slide. So I've got a bit of time now. Yep, great. So that is the close of the technical content that we wanted to go through. I was going to spend a bit of time on the assignment just to make sure everyone felt comfortable about what that involved. So Ken, did you want to add anything before I got stuck in?
No, I think you've done well. You covered things off nicely there, Max. So let's jump into describing that assignment, make sure everybody's clear on that. And
sure. I just wanted to quickly touch on this one about if you're doing any traffic management works around bicycle lanes, very, very common just to see traffic management signs being used within the bicycle lane itself, or blocking off the lane, or, no detours being put in place where there are bicycle lane closures. Just have a real think about how cyclists would use that network, where they're going to go, where do they want to go, is it safe for them to access from A to B? Because this is incredibly common and incredibly frustrating as a cyclist, where your lane just gets closed. Once again, I'll put it in that perspective of, imagine this traffic management company just putting this sign in the traffic lane. There would be uproar. You'd be calling the police immediately and things like that. But this kind of things happens every day for cyclists. So just something to keep mind of if you are operating within that space, or you're about to be building your wonderful cycling projects. Well, what does the interim look like? How do we continue to maintain our cycling network? I'll just stop that share for a second and head over to Moodle now. I mean, the LMS. Yeah, go screen two. That's on the LMS there, Ken?
Yep.
That's excellent. So at the end of today's session, once again, we've got another 360-degree video. So same as before, we'll get you to click on the link, open it up, and you can either use your, oh, it's a nice sunny day. You can either use your goggles to watch it, or just watch it through the YouTube viewer on your PC, and remember to scroll around to have a look through that. So that's the same as module 1, just same process there. Get you to watch that before our next session on Tuesday. But as mentioned, for this module, we do actually have an assignment. So it's not a quiz, it is an assignment. To access it, you just click on module 2 assignment, and it takes you to these 2 documents here. One's a Word document, one's a PDF. I've already got these ones open, so I'm just going to open the Word document first.
Yep.
Okay. So yours will look something like this. It's just a template. It says download and review module 2 design review file. That was just the other PDF that was saved in that directory that I showed you before. So you're going to download that PDF, review that. Step 2, review the existing conditions of the site using Google Street View. So the site that you're looking at is York Street in Launceston. If you click on this link here, it will just take you to York Street in Launceston. So you can just grab the little Street View fellow and plonk him down on the road, just so you've got an idea of what that environment looks like, and maybe even have a look out for any speed signs so you can guess the speed environment. And if there's any things of concern that you may pick up on if you were cycling within that environment. Step 3 is filling out the table provided. So there's just a few questions that will get you to answer. And step 4 is save and upload this document onto the LMS. So once you've finished it all, so you'll need to just insert your name, fill out these questions, go back to the LMS. On this screen here at the bottom, there will be a upload my submission. Mine looks different because I'm a moderator. I'll be grading the submissions, but yours will be there, and you can just upload it in there, and then we'll get a notification saying that you've uploaded it, and we'll grade it, pass on any feedback. If you do not meet that 80% benchmark requirement, then we'll get you to resubmit, or we'll provide you a bit of feedback as to why you may not have achieved that. The questions that we will get you to answer are deliberately concise and meant to be straightforward, and we hope that the responses we get are also of that nature. So we're not expecting essays. We're not expecting you to spend long time coming up with responses to these questions. In fact, if it's taken more than 20 minutes to complete this, probably just give us a call, because maybe you've gone down a different path, and we just want to make sure that we're giving you, just what you need to be able to get the answers succinctly put through, and you don't need to, write War and Peace to get this successfully passed. But anyway, question number 1. How does the existing environment cater for cyclists? So have a look at your Google Street View. We'll give you some thoughts there. Imagine if you were cycling along York Street, how would that feel? What type of infrastructure exists there? That could be another way that could be phrased. Question number 2, how does the design cater for cyclists? And this is where I might actually open up the second document, which was that PDF. So the PDF looks like this one here. And there is a little disclaimer there at the top that this design is just for this training course. So please don't discuss it with any Launceston locals or any of your local MPs or anything like that, because I don't want to put a spanner in the works. It's just meant for this training exercise. But yes, this is just the overall sheet. There's only 4 sheets here. It just takes you along from George Street in the east or the north, sorry, yep, to Wellington Street. And this is kind of what you're looking at. And if you haven't looked at designs before or anything like that, just give me a call. I'm happy to talk through it. But the legend is provided. So the general idea is there's some bicycle lanes being installed. There's some islands, some build outs, curb extensions, whatever language you like to use are being installed. There's also these raised intersections being installed at various locations. It's kind of carried along at each of the locations. And oh yeah, so they're proposing a 50km/h York Street precinct speed as well. So that's what that all means. So hopefully that is clear. That's what the design is. So question number 2 is all about how does that design cater for cyclists? Okay, so the first one was existing conditions. Second one is the design. The third question is now you get to put your design hat on, or you can reference all the material that we've gone through in module 1 and module 2 and have a think about what treatments or changes in the design would you be recommending to improve safety for cyclists. I haven't given you a budget, but I would just keep in mind if your response is, I don't know, ban cyclists here and put them on Queen Street, the next one over or something like that. It's probably correct, but it's not really the answer that I'm looking for here. So just make sure that it's feasible within this scope of works and it's relevant and it's pertinent. So you've been tasked with improving the York Street design. What can you do as designers with your skills within cycling infrastructure? Like, what do you know that works for cyclist safety to implement within that design to improve the safety? We're only after 3 solutions there. So once again, if you've got 10 or 50, that's great, but we'll probably just look at the first 3. So just make sure you're capturing 3 there, okay? That was it for all the module 2. Did anyone have any questions on the assignment or on any of the content that we've gone through today? So we've once again left a bit of time at the end of this session. So you've got some opportunity to get a head start on the assignments.
There was a question in there around trying to incorporate bicycle lanes and pedestrian crossings in an intersection with space constraints. I suppose any thoughts you had on that? We might need to sort of see a design or the intersection itself to get a gauge on that. But any thoughts there, Max?
The next module is actually intersections. So we will be chatting quite in depth about managing that conflict in particular between cyclists and pedestrians. It's definitely a relevant question, particularly in those constrained locations. But yeah, we've got more information coming up next Tuesday to go through that. So I might just put that on the shelf for the moment.
Okay.
Fabulous. Well, thanks everyone again. Good luck with module 2. Any issues, please get in touch with training team or myself directly, and we'll be happy to help you out. Otherwise, have a lovely weekend and yeah, happy riding.
Yeah, get stuck into that assignment. And we'll see you next time. A little bit early for a chance to win a prize. Max will do some more trivia.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Ken. Yes. Come on early for some trivia.
Bye, everyone.